Okay, welcome to the Leadership Zone. Today I have Orlagh Costello, right, as their guest. And Orlagh and I have been crossing paths for a very long time. And I've been watching Orlagh's LinkedIn posts, and Orlagh really does come from quite an interesting perspective and probably a really underserved perspective when we think about Ireland and the UK. So before I go in and tell you all the wrong things about Orlagh or say everything wrong, Orlagh, will you let listeners know kind of who you are, what you're about, your background, and then we can kick into some of the kind of topics of today's discussion.
Yeah, no problem. So I'm an engineer and I've been an engineer for more than 20 years now, which means, as one of my friends said, I'm one of those friends that know when bad weather is coming by an ache in my joints. We've reached that age now, Sheila. I started off in very heavy industry in my career. I started off in the steel industry. I've moved through different industries throughout my time, and I started recognizing some regular issues or barriers or concerns or whatever throughout my career. And I started realizing that my friends were experiencing similar things. So I kind of thought we need to start having discussions about women in engineering. We need to start having discussions about the barriers we face. We need to start discussing some of the different issues that face women in engineering versus men in engineering. Now, I'm going to say straight up, I'm dealing with this in a fairly binary way, right?
Mm.
There are different issues that affect non-binary people, that affect trans people in engineering. So I'm not excluding those. I just have a lot of experience with women in
Mm.
engineering, and that's what I'm focused on. I put a post on LinkedIn a while ago there. It came from my page a day calendar, and it was like, be the person you need it when you had no
Mm.
one. And that's kind of what I'm trying to do here, because all these problems keep recurring. I see them again and again and again to a greater or lesser extent. And when you've lived through it, you learn better ways of dealing with it, and we can pass that information and that help on to
Okay, excellent. That's really helpful. I think I've worked with a few engineers who are female, and I think it's a really common discussion that's had on the sideline. And what
yeah,
I've noticed you do, which I think is a bit different, is you have the discussion not on the sideline. You're happy to say it regardless of who's in the room, and you're happy
yeah,
to bring attention to kind of some of the key aspects that are really important. Whereas what I have found is that often people don't feel that safe doing it, or women
yeah,
feel like, I don't want people to think I'm the woman engineer. I want to be the
yeah.
engineer, so I'm not going to talk about the barriers women are facing. So can you tell me a little bit about what you would class as kind of the main barriers that you see repetitively
Yeah.
in the profession?
So I suppose one of the reasons that I'm happy to talk about it is that I'm fairly confident in my career at this point. I have a skill set that is a good skill set for employers, and people tend to appreciate what it is I do. And so I'm not as worried about being branded as the woman in engineering anymore. I just kind of live it and I say, I am the woman in engineering, deal with it. That's actually one of the biggest barriers that people have. It's almost like once we get into engineering, as women, we're kind of afraid if anyone even notices we're different.
Mm.
And like
As
by
if they
saying,
don't.
it's kind of like you have to be one of the lads, you have to fit in, or else you have to fade away into the background. And that does us no good. We have a right to be ourselves at work, the same as everybody else. And I mean, I know you feel this way as well because, we've been crossing paths for a while now. But it's almost like earlier in my career, right? I come back to two things here, right? In very early on in my career, I was the only woman among 300 men. And I struggled to get a bathroom to use that was safe for me to use.
Mm.
Eventually, there was a toilet found that was literally half a mile away because I measured it. And, I couldn't even put a bolt on the door. It was a key lock, and several people around the plant had keys to that door. So I got really nervous about using the bathroom and work. So I just stopped drinking until about 4 o'clock in the evening. And then I'd hydrate myself.
Can I
And
just stop you
because,
for a second? That brings me
yeah,
back to, the scene from Hidden Figures
yeah,
where the black woman, even though she's in the main area making like really key decisions, has to trek all the way back down to a segregated toilet.
yeah,
Even though it wasn't segregation, it's the same effect.
yeah,
Yeah.
it is. And, look, it was almost worse in that poor woman's case because there was a bathroom she could have used. Whereas in mine, because of the industry I was in at the time, women just weren't even considered out on plant because they'd never been there.
Mm.
The notion that like I needed bathroom facilities almost came as an afterthought. And it kind of like had to be found, somewhere had to be found for me. At the time, I was new into the industry. I was really shy. I was having a huge culture shock in terms of like I had never been exposed to heavy industry before. So there was all this different things acting on me that I just didn't feel able or comfortable to speak out and say, I need safer bathroom facilities.
Mm,
I need to be able to go to the toilet when I need to go to the toilet without worrying about someone walking in on me, you know? And nowadays I have zero issue with that. But nowadays I also check the bathroom situation when I go for an interview because that's just something that's ingrained in me. And it's something I can laugh about now because it's less of an issue. Most places I go now, there are plenty of facilities for men and women. And now the argument about bathrooms has moved on to
mm,
non-binary or trans people and how they manage and how they're comfortable to use bathrooms. And I think that's progress in a way. It's not where we want to be, but it's
mm,
progress in a way. But the other thing I had was where I had a manager sit down with me once. And again, I hadn't hit 30 at this point,
mm,
and I had just gone through a major breakup, and I was very upset about all this. And he sat me down and he said, well, Orla, you really need to choose between having a career and having a family. And I'm like, sorry, what? And he's like, you can't have both as a woman. And I'm just looking at him. And I had a mentor in the business at a time who was an engineer and who was a woman and who had 3 kids. And I said this to her, and she was just like, he said, what to you? And I was like, yeah, like, what the hell? And she's like, well, what does he think I'm doing? you know?
mm,
But the assumption was that as a woman, I couldn't be at home being a wife and mother and be an engineer at the same time.
mm,
He couldn't see how what he expected of as an engineer was compatible with being a mother. And it was just such a rigid, horrible view that,
mm.
okay, this was 15 years ago, but at the same time, there are still
Only
people who
15
think
years
that
ago.
way. Yeah,
Mm,
you
mm,
know. And so as I started gaining more confidence in things, I started thinking we have to start the conversation about these issues. There are very few people now who will come out and say explicitly to somebody, you can't be a wife and mother, you can't be a mother and be an engineer. It doesn't come out as explicitly as that, but
mm,
it can come out in other ways so that, the statistics around when a man gets married, it's seen as a good thing and
mm,
his salary increases. When a woman gets married, the career gets paused or slowed down because people don't trust she's not going to go off and have a whole rake of babies and affect them with maternity leave or whatever.
mm,
And again, people don't say this. And most organizations have structures in place to try and combat that. It's recognized as an issue. But at the same time, if a good project comes up and someone's just back off maternity leave, there can be a tendency for a manager to go, something, we won't stress her out right now. We'll let her settle in. And if they only went to the woman in question and had a conversation with her, they might find that actually she's dying to get her teeth into something really, really good.
mm,
And that would help her immensely right now to be able to engage in something challenging at work. They
mm,
make the decision for her.
mm,
And for me, this is a form of benevolent sexism. They wouldn't do the same for a man.
mm,
If a man has a new child, it's seen as a good thing. Like he gets his 2 week paternity, he's allowed to be a bit grumpy when the child doesn't sleep or whatever, but it doesn't affect their career in the same way.
mm, mm.
And I don't think that people are even making these decisions consciously.
No.
A lot of the time, it's like it's that unconscious. We're trying to be nice. We're trying to accommodate. We're trying to consider the family situation, but they don't even realize they're doing it differently for men and women.
And I think you're spot on because even when I'm teaching kind of the women in leadership and I'm having discussions about gender, there's a couple of assumptions. One is the assumption that it's men doing it to women, but we
Mm.
know that actually in the workplace it's not divided like that.
Yeah,
We know in society there's particular harm that is perpetrated by men more than women. We do know that.
yeah,
But
yeah,
in workplaces, it's actually everybody does it to women, including
yeah.
other women. And I think that's a really important thing to think about because thankfully you had a mentor who said, what does he think I'm doing? But you could equally had a mentor who said, well, I had to hide this or actually have given you unhelpful
Oh
adaptations.
yeah.
You could easily have got that advice
Mhm.
instead.
Oh, and I've got those
Yeah.
those bits of advice as well. Don't get me wrong. I've got the whole, oh, sure, they're only messing, just ignore them and they'll go away, or they're only messing, they don't really mean it the way you're taking it, and all that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I've had all of those things. It's rubbish,
Well,
right?
well,
It's pure
also,
rubbish.
I think what's really dodgy about that is if we normalize something, they actually don't know, right? And I don't
Yeah,
mean that in a, I do believe that we should practice calling in before we practice calling out.
yeah,
I think it's helpful to pull someone aside and say, just so you know, don't say that again to me in front
yeah,
of people. Or just so you know, you've actually crossed the line there. You want to manage that. I think what can happen is that when people speak up, they only speak up in a kind of calling out in the moment. And then people feel bad about the situation and uncomfortable and they try to squash the situation by saying, shit, it's not that bad,
Yeah.
But actually, we need to make sure that we are training people, all people, how to treat us. And I think that comes down to our skill at letting people know that there's the people who actually don't know it's inappropriate, right? There are, and I've been those people, so I know that they exist, right? I am
Same here.
those
right
people
there with
still.
you.
And then there's the people who know they've crossed a line with you and continue to. And the thing is that other people can't always see that nuance. Only the person experiencing it can, because you notice how the person has made the decisions that they've made to say it. Whereas you might be around others who say something and you're like, lads, cut that now.
Yeah.
It's no big offense. You're not having a big argument. You're just, that's not the standard we engage at here. But I think that sometimes we don't know the difference between almost ignorance and a standard needing to be set versus what I would consider more intentional power dominance that happens.
Yeah.
That people are actually gaining a buzz of putting someone down or dominating them. Whereas there's others who don't even see that thing as doing that. They don't really get it and they need some education and usually kind of support to understand it. But then you've got the actual harmful, I would consider the people who misuse power as kind of those. And I think there are two different strategies that we don't often talk about, that if I approach everyone with this strategy, that they are actively in a power struggle with me. Versus approaching it that you're like, you've overstepped, you're out of bounds, that's not appropriate, let's not have this conversation again. I think what can happen is we can create an awful lot of defensiveness that doesn't help anybody, actually, because nobody learns, or the wrong people are learning, you know, and then the people who actually need to figure out what's happening aren't having the conversations.
And I think as well, there's an element here of, particularly with women in engineering, as I said, they like to fade into the background. They don't like to make a fuss. So they swallow it and they swallow it and they swallow it until they get to the point where they explode. And then it's seen as hysteria or overreaction, which it might be in the minute, in the moment, but it's not when you consider everything they've been dealing with over the last month or 6 months or years or whatever. You know, and being able to nip that in the bud is, as you say, a skill that you have to learn. I mean, look, I'll give you a fairly innocuous example, right? There's somebody I work with right now. I spell my name Orlagh. That GH is kind of important to me. You know, it's a whole third of my name. I like it, right? And there's one particular person I work at who is just having a real difficulty remembering the GH.
Right.
And they obviously know someone who spells it Orla, and that's what's default in their thing. And I reminded them of it a few times, kind of verbally, and then it was like kept on happening. So I've reminded them now in writing a few times, and we're starting to make a joke on it. And they're coming back to me going, God, I can't believe I keep making this mistake. I'm so sorry. I will do better. Right. It's not something I'm willing to drop because it's my name. And I feel that, like, calling someone by the name that they want to be called by is kind of important, and that spellings are important. And I get really upset with myself when I make a misspelling of someone else's name. So it's something I'm willing to put that effort into. But equally, it's not something I want to stand up in front of everyone and go, for feck's sake, would you ever just say it properly? That's not what it's about, right? But it is about reminding people that actually this is my name. You know, this is something I've had to learn how to do. It's not something we're born knowing. So especially when you're the only woman in the room, it can be really difficult to stand up and say, okay, look, I get that that's a funny joke, but it's not acceptable. I'm not okay with it. Please don't do that again. Great. Thanks. Bye. It's really difficult.
Yeah, I like your idea about the name, because it's funny, because I actually don't care how people spell my name, right? Why don't I care? Well, like, my name is important to me, but I understand it lands internationally for different people in different ways. People pronounce it wrong. But what I do know is that for people, for lots of very valid reasons, their name being misspelled is a representation, or mispronounced, a representation of, like, a lack of due care towards their personhood. And I think that one thing we don't always think about, and I do this, and I'm sure when you're coaching women as well, I often talk to women about what you're standardizing. So if you're correcting names, that is going to, in a productive, effective way, like we're discussing, right? That's going to create a standard that others who are having challenges around their names for lots of reasons, international, they're transitioning, like loads of reasons, you've made that a normal, acceptable standard in your workplace, right? And I often talk to women about how, when we are strategic and we think about these changes, we're usually setting a higher standard of appropriate interactions. It's not really just about you. So, like, there's many. Come here, I'd be terrified if anyone. I'm so glad we didn't have phones when I was a teenager, because I'd be terrified if they caught
Absolutely.
the jokes I made, the things I laughed at, the points of view I had, mortified. I don't know how these generations are going to cope with that shame, because I know what I feel now knowing I said it, right? Or knowing I thought it.
And there's no actual proof.
And there's no proof, right? There's nobody pulling it up when I don't know, celebrate on my birthday and someone goes, remember when you were 11, you said this. But I think there's a piece here about also knowing, and I say this to women quite a bit because they don't always know that this is a normal response, that when a joke is made about you or a joke is at you, even if it's not about you, so it's harmful in some way, usually there's a couple of things happening. One is other people don't mean it the way it is actually happening, right? That doesn't make it acceptable. But I mean, so I make a joke, I think it's funny, and then I don't think about the consequence of that joke on you because I don't have your lived experience. So it just didn't come to mind that this probably is more harmful than I think it is, right? So that's one layer. And then they think the joke's funny. But the other moment is when you have to decide, do I laugh? Do I say something? Did they mean that? Did I pick that up right? Like I go through a checklist, right? When something happens. And I have so many times laughed at jokes I would now not laugh at. And I was working with a woman, she said, like, how do I deal with it? I have an automatic laugh response to get out of the situation. I was like, that's called fight, flight, and freeze. That's your flight. It's perfectly okay. What you do is you go back afterwards and address it.
Yeah.
Like in a way that feels appropriate for the situation, the context of it, whatever. But what can happen is people think I didn't address it in the moment, so I can't address it. And I would say that actually most of us, like I have to go through a checklist sometimes. Like when somebody says something, I'm like, is that my interpretation? Because you know how words can have duplication or even industries, or like I remember someone messaged me years ago, happy hump day. I didn't know what hump day was. Anyone knows hump day is Wednesday now. I think it's an Australian.
It's downhill to the weekend.
Yeah, right.
That's what you're looking at.
It's the hump day, right? I didn't know that. So he emailed me happy hump day. My manager saw it at the time and was like, excuse me? I was like, I'm very confused because we're not friendly. Like this guy and me aren't friendly. I was like, so the two of us, my manager, thank God, was a male and was like, I'll address that for you, Grant. A couple of hours later, he's like, Sheila, Australian thing. I was like, what? So he's like, the two of us are on Google. Did you say anything? No, thank God. Because I was like, did this man just say that to me, right?
Yeah.
He did, because it didn't mean what I thought it meant. So that's like a silly example of when I got it wrong. But I've equally been in a room, and I'm going to use racism as an example, where somebody has made a racist comment to somebody I know. And I assume they have an in-joke because the other person laughed.
Yes.
And I was like, that's really inappropriate. Nobody would say that to someone they don't know. The person leaves and I said, I didn't know you knew each other. We don't.
Yeah.
That was a racist joke. Yeah. I was like, I thought because you laughed, and also because I couldn't believe someone would make that joke, at all, not to mention in front of you, that it was a joke. So sometimes we go through this checklist process to even understand what just happened. And I think that women can be really hard on themselves for not speaking up when they realize, or once they feel safe again, going, oh, that just happened. What's your sense of that from your own work?
I think that's really, really relevant right now. I mean, I've taken the habit over the last few years, when a new member joins my team, I have a kind of an intro conversation with them, casual over coffee and stuff. And I started with just women, and then I started expanding it. And I started saying, look, I don't expect there to be problems of this nature in this environment, but if there are, I want you to come talk to me about it. And I will step in if you want me to, or if you're unsure about whether you want me to or not. Most of the women who work for me, and I'm not just limiting this to women, I've got foreigners on my team, I've got people who are differently abled. There's been a kind of an expansion of this from when I first started it, because when I was starting, I was focused on women because that was what was affecting me most. But, it affects others as well. And all of the people I have this conversation with say to me, no other manager has had this direct a conversation with me. And I've said to it, I have a Black woman on my team. And I said, look, I don't expect racism to be an issue here, but I also know I won't pick up on it all the time. So if you're having an issue, if you even suspect that it's an issue to do with your skin color or your race or whatever it is, I really want you to come talk to me. And I said, this is not because I don't think you can deal with it, but it's because I don't think you should have to deal with it. And we can decide how to deal with it together. I will fall in line with what you want, but I do want you to come and talk to me about it so that I will start recognizing more, be able to address it and nip it in the bud.
Yes.
And it's shocking to me the amount of people who say to me, no manager has ever had this conversation with me. Like, as a leader of a team, this is my job. this is what I see as part of my job. My team should not have to deal with sexism or racism or transphobia or whatever
They don't
the
come to
issue
work
or
to
the
be
ism is. No,
further
we're here to
discriminated
do a
against
job.
or
Like,
marginalized.
let's be serious, Sheila, right? We turn up to work to get paid, right? For most of us, if we didn't need money to pay the rent or the mortgage or whatever it is, we would not be turning up to work for 40, 50, 60 hours a week. That's not the way we're built. And like, while we're here to do a job. We're not here to get abused or laughed at or whatever. And I mean, there's so many people out there who think they have to swallow this, that they can't raise a fuss, or that they stand out in so many different ways. And the energy of having to educate other people is just too much. And I completely understand that because I've felt it.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example that has nothing to do with any ism at all, really. But I spent 11 years working in England.
Mm-hmm.
And what I found was that I knew more about English history than they did, because the Irish education system, you tend to cover a lot of English history because it affects Ireland quite a bit. And so I spent 11 years teaching people about things like Cromwell and the Tudors, how colonization got started and all the rest of it. And it's not that these people are really educated. It's not that they're like stupid or not able to learn. They just were never told this stuff. But the first time someone makes an Irish joke or a Paddy joke or whatever, you laugh, you're kind of like, yeah, whatever, I can't be bothered with this. The 5 millionth time someone does it, it's kind of like, okay, here we go again. Let's have a chat. And you really have to gear yourself up for it.
Yeah, and I think this is a really good point because I was, like in the UK right now, they're teaching that jokes are not inclusive, by the way, right? Generally, they're teaching that. I disagree with it because in Irish culture, crack is how we know we belong, right? Like I joke in my family.
If no one is pulling the proverbial out of you, are you really friends?
Yeah. You're not in, right?
Yes.
So I've been thinking about this because I also think people misuse jokes and weaponize them. And I was kind of giving examples to people saying that in my family, everything is on the table, by the way. Like you can rip anyone for anything, like within, we'll say my siblings and my parents, right?
Yeah.
Within our group, everything. Partners, God love them, they have to buy into this process too, right?
Yeah.
Everything's on the table. But what's on the table is because we actually don't care.
Yeah.
So if I rip it about you, it has no meaning. The issue is if somebody's not joking about it.
Yes.
Then we might really have an issue, right?
Yes.
Because something is happening that it's not up for being pulled apart. Like there is something attached to it. I often think about the kind of jokes and stuff. And like I have two brothers. I grew up in male-dominated environments because I grew up in kitchens originally. I was often the only female on site, like in kitchens or whatever. Often not only the only female, I might be in charge of a team and they're double my age. Like there was lots of these kind of significant things. And I would have humor that is quite close to what a lot of lads would have. I'm not talking about toxic masculinity humor now, by the way. I'm talking about like, I can take a joke, I can crack a joke, like we're good for it. But then there's this line where the joke isn't reciprocal. So if we've just met and you put me down as a joke, that's not bonding because we don't have a connection, right? But also if we've met and we don't have a safe relationship and you make jokes about me or at me, then that's not a joke. That's actually like, that's crossing a line. But also in shared environments, if jokes aren't something that brings us closer together, and I'm not talking about the content of it because everyone has different feelings about that, but if the joke doesn't bring us closer together and is about one of us or both of us or whatever, then it's not a joke to me. It is actually like abusive or oppressive or harmful. But it's not about now, obviously there are blatantly jokes none of us should be telling or saying.
Absolutely.
I'm not talking about those ones now. I'm talking about the line where you're like, okay, well, if my brother hadn't said that to me, I'd kill the person who did. Do you know that? Like that type of like, and lots of people think that I shouldn't have a different standard, but I do, because the difference is how I feel about how the person respects you or respects me. But I think what's getting a bit confused is often if women speak up, what I'm hearing is people say you can't take a joke, right? And then I'm like, say the joke, right? So the joke is repeated and you're like, would your child be called into the office over that in school?
Yeah.
Would this be okay if I was saying it about you, like, or your identity group in a way that you're already kind of experiencing some kind of oppression? And when you start to break it down like that, it's a bit like, oh, okay. But what often happens is that the defense is to reject the woman for not having the crack, right?
Yeah.
We have to be wildly wildly up for crack if we work in male dominated environments. Like we are
Oh
better at
yes.
crack than men. Like, and I don't mean that we make better jokes. I mean, we've had to deal with more levels of that idea
Mm-hmm.
of crack than most people do. But there's something about knowing that there is these differences and not allowing someone else to tell you that that's okay because they didn't mean anything by it. If
Yes.
actually it's setting a standard of unacceptable behavior in a setting or unacceptable
It's
conduct.
it's up to each individual what they consider acceptable and unacceptable, right? I mean, like in my general day-to-day life, I swear a lot. All right.
Mm.
It's just, it's a way of stress relief. It's one of the healthier ways I've got for stress relief. And the amount of four-letter words that come out of my mouth increase exponentially when I'm under a lot of pressure, right? That I know don't like swearing. My mommy is one of them. I
Yes.
do my best not to swear in front of her. When I know that somebody isn't comfortable with that or has expressed to me that they'd prefer if I didn't do it, I'll do my best to not swear in front of them. That doesn't mean I never will, but
Mm.
you do your best to make sure that that's okay. I'll give you another example. My darling husband is English, God help him, and
Did you educate
he
him on the history? I hope you did.
we're working on it. I mean,
Okay.
we
It's
send
a
them to
lifetime project.
it really is. I mean, we send them to watch In the Name of the Father and Michael Collins at least twice a year, just as
Good,
a
good.
basic. But he is referred to in my family as the heathen fairly regularly, right? And I mean, he buys into this. He has a laugh and a joke about it. It's okay. Like you said, it's a
Yeah.
safe environment. One of the first times he came over to visit my parents, Dad was saying to me, "Oh, well, we have a drink tonight." I said, "Oh yeah, well, we open a bottle of red wine." And Al's sitting there on the couch and he just looks at me and he goes, "Well, this is okay now, but you do realize once we're married, you're going to have to ask permission before drinking." My dad nearly wet himself, you know? And I mean, within that environment, that's perfectly fine.
Yeah.
My husband knows damn well that I will never ask for permission
Yeah,
before
yeah.
having a drink.
And he's not saying it in front of others who would use it over you in some way.
Exactly. He knows also that my father knows the daughter he reared,
Yes.
and it's like, that's when dad started realizing that Al is actually okay to joke with. It went on from there. But if he had said that in a different environment, if he had said that in front of work colleagues that didn't know me very well, or if
Yes.
he had said that in front of a bunch of his friends who didn't know me, I would not have laughed. I'd have felt very upset. But he would never have done that. So this is where we need to understand that people get to set the standards that are acceptable to them in the environments that they're in. And something that's acceptable with your husband or your family or your close friends isn't always acceptable in the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
And it may not be just because it's in a professional environment. It may just be you're not as comfortable with those people. And
Mm-hmm.
you are allowed to stand up and say, "I'm not okay with that."
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is that I referred to this earlier, but the problem is that very often we feel we have to just accept it all and we have to laugh and we have to do the crack and we have to, be the good woman or whatever. And then it just gets too much.
Mm.
And you end up completely checking out of the workplace and kind of stepping back from your own career, or you end up job hopping until you find some place that actually you can stand. And or else you just kind of end up exploding in the middle of a really inappropriate moment because
Mm.
it's usually a high pressure situation when you're stressed to 90 already. And then someone turns around and says something that, in hindsight, is probably relatively innocuous, but it's just that last straw.
Mm.
And you can't contain it anymore. It's too
Mm.
much. And then your dabbed hysterical woman can't handle the pressure. Off she goes.
Yeah, as opposed to acknowledging that actually the fact that that's the thing she reacted to means that she's been maintaining pressure that others haven't seen or been aware of,
Yeah,
and actually probably dealing with a lot of side conversations or occurrences of something
exactly.
and just letting it go. And I think that sometimes the challenge as well is they won't listen, right? Like I hear that a
Yeah,
lot, like they won't listen. And I'd kind of say it doesn't matter
no,
because the minute you say it, you're
yes.
saying you matter. Now they don't have to listen, but you can say it again
Yeah,
because we don't tell people things because we can control what they do. We
no,
say it because we're telling them how to interact with us. And
yes.
we're also creating accountability about the fact that they're interacting in a way we dislike. And people don't always think about it in that kind of very basic way, which is
Mm,
if you dislike it. Now, I will say in the workplace, and I think this is where people get really, really confused. I kind of have a kind of overarching thing because of the legislation that we have, both for service users, for employment law. We shouldn't be making jokes about anything related to in the workplace at all,
mm,
unfortunately, about anything related to any of the protected characteristics. In
mm,
fact, I know people who make jokes about themselves. I'm not sure where I am on that one. I just know from an employment law perspective, it's
yeah,
not clever, right? Now, that doesn't mean that when you go to work, when you go out with your buddies, you're not making a joke about yourself or about an identity that you kind of like cracking out, like the Irish thing, like, oh yeah, where are the potatoes now, lads? You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
this, it's not saying that you can't do that, but in the workplace, when you do it, and I think women need to know this, it's not just, even if it is considered banter by everybody's standards, the minute there's a
Yes.
reference to gender, it's not. And that's why in the workplace, and I'm not talking about in society because I don't know where I stand on like even some comedians and stuff. In the workplace, there are actually boundaries around what is considered discrimination, and
Mm.
jokes that put down any of the protected groups within that legislation are actually technically discrimination. And I'll go a step further because people don't like to talk about this. Same with if you do it about men, because in
Yeah.
our legislation in Ireland, it covers gender, not women, it covers gender.
Yes.
And so if you put someone down because of their gender, or you make a joke that's derogatory and it's related to gender, you're actually like discriminating. And if somebody has a record of you doing that repeatedly, we have a situation. So it's just not
Yes.
clever.
And it does bring up another thing that people tend to forget, that it's that record of doing it continually. That's really, really important. And that's where the kind of the swallowing it and swallowing it and swallowing it actually works against you. It's much better if you can gain the skill of being able to say, look, that's not okay. I don't like this. And be able to say that repeatedly, because then when you're going to say to someone more senior, or you're trying to escalate it, or you're trying to get some support, you can honestly say, look, whenever this has come up, I have said this and I've made it clear I'm not happy about this. This isn't something that I've been hiding. And it makes it easier then for the various mechanisms in a large organization to step in and start working. Whereas if you've said, look, I haven't felt able to say this, I haven't felt safe to say this, which is still entirely relevant, right? But it just means that the process starts at a few steps further back.
Yes.
And you have to kind of go through all this coaching and engagement and all the rest of it before you can make a step on the next level. And sometimes just even the fact that you've said it once and you've said, look, I'm really uncomfortable with you making jokes like that, or I really don't like that you're making jokes in this area, or I'm not happy that this is being said. That's enough to be able to say, look, you've set your standards, you've made it clear, they continued, so now we have an approach we can take.
Yeah. And I want to say something to the people who might have had someone tell them that and they're like,
yeah,
nobody else worried about my joke. I told it to Sile the other day and she laughed, right? One of the things to know is if somebody is telling you what they don't like, they're actually doing you a favor for a couple of reasons. One is they're telling you that they want to remain in contact with you in some way. So they're saying, this is how you should engage with me. And because they're saying, actually, I want to stay in contact, which means they're not trying to escalate a situation. They're not looking to get you. There's none of that happening, right? They're actually saying, can we work well together? I'm telling you something you don't know. It doesn't make you a bad person. You didn't know. Okay.
Yes.
The issue is that people take that initial feedback as an attack when actually it's an invitation to engage in a more effective relationship, and at work in particular, professional relationship. So I just think it's really important for anyone who's had it said and says, well, I'm not like that. And the other thing is people also, and I'm not talking about women here, I'm talking about people can make all sorts of complaints about all sorts of things at work because, wow, like work is an interesting place. So our job when we get feedback is to listen and decide how that relates to our role in the workplace and our relationship with the person. And most of the time when someone tells you initially, lads, cut it, or that's not on, or look, you overstepped, you need to pull back now, they're telling you, I want to remain in contact with no drama. Most people do not want to escalate. Most people do not want to create a situation or have to deal with a situation. Most people just want to go to work. Back to your point, get paid. But what can happen is people can become kind of so defensive that they don't understand that this is actually an opportunity to create protection for themselves and to create protection for the other person. And I just think that that's a really important thing to occur, because even between women, and I know this from different workplaces, the woman is making a sexist joke, another woman can still take calls with that, and it's still a gender-based issue, right? So this isn't about the gender of the person doing the thing. It's about what you are doing that is derogatory or harmful to a particular group.
It doesn't even have to be someone who's involved in the conversation. It can be someone who overhears about or hears a conversation about it. You know, it doesn't really need to be directly involved. And I think, you know, people have to consider that genuinely, if you're trying to escalate something like this, it involves paperwork. And most people do not want that. They want to solve it before it gets official. Right. Look, people have said stuff to me and I've been initially like, you know, what the hell? Like, this is, you know, but then you think about it and you have to start thinking about it and you have to start examining your own behavior. And eventually it comes down to, you know, something, if that made someone uncomfortable, it's not something I want to repeat. Most people are good people and that's what it comes down to. It's not a personal attack. And the impact of something matters more than the intention. And
Yeah.
if we remember that, then it makes it easier to take that feedback. So when someone turns around and said, look, I'm not really comfortable with the way you handle this. Okay, what happened? What wasn't good? Let's learn about this. It's really difficult to do in certain situations,
Yeah.
but it's nearly always worth it.
It's funny, or I have a process called FAR, like
Mm,
FARR, and it's for how you deal with that type of thing. So
mm,
it might be interesting for listeners to look up. It's literally how you process. So before
yeah.
we finish, if you were to leave people with kind of three nuggets of wisdom or advice after listening to
Mhm.
you, and I suppose we're talking about people in engineering, we're talking about women in lots of industries, what kind of three pieces of advice do you think would be helpful to leave listeners with?
Honestly, the first thing I'd say is know yourself, right? Know your boundaries, know your standards, know what you're willing to accept, and know what you're not willing to accept. And as we said, that can change from situation to situation. But once you know what you're clear on, then it makes life so much easier in how you react and when you react to certain things. The second thing I'd say is that there's always an element of reconciling our past, because we have behaved in the past in ways that we would not consider acceptable now.
Mm,
I can say that from the heart. I have said and done things in the last 44 years that I am ashamed of and I don't like and I would not redo now.
during the
But
phone, yeah.
to quote that wonderful quote from Maya Angelou, and I'm going to butcher it, when you know better, you do better.
Mm,
This is what we have to work on, right? And then the last thing I would say is reach out for help. Okay. You are not alone. It doesn't matter if you're the only woman in 300 men. Trust me when I say there are other women out there in the same situation. If you're the only man in 300 women,
mm.
trust me when I say there's other men out there who are in the same situation. You are not alone. There are people out there that can help. There are people that will support you. Do not struggle and make it harder for yourself. Reach out and get the help.
I think that that's fabulous. And I think, again, that reaching out piece leans to it's not just about you as an individual, but it's knowing that you're
Yeah.
facing barriers because there are systemic barriers, which means
Yeah,
other people are facing them too, which is
absolutely.
fortunate and also helpful when we're
Yes.
kind of feeling alone. I want to really thank you. I think it's always really helpful when we talk to people who have seen a pattern long enough in their
Yeah.
own professional experience to then take it and say, well, actually, there's an unmet need here in the
Yeah.
group. And I know what we've talked about today is kind of some heavy stuff. Like I know that we're talking about heavy stuff, but I'm hoping that listeners will understand that relationships are messy.
Yeah.
And if there's nothing else, we have to decide what the standards are and how we're going to help co-create with other people those standards. Some people are going to be willing to co-create and learn from what you give them, and other
Hmm.
people aren't. And you're going to have to make decisions about that. And that's true for everybody, regardless of their gender or industry. But it
Yeah.
can be a really hard thing when you've experienced kind of marginalization. I just think it's important for people to remember that we are always doing our best in co-creating our standards. And some
Yes.
systems and some environments aren't designed with us in mind.
Yeah.
And we will have to be the people who help carve that out. All
Yes.
right. Thank you for being with me. I really appreciate it. And people can follow up with you in the links below.